When kindness to one bride awakens, the hidden clan behind her, does the valley gain peace or inherit danger? The wind cut through Bitter Creek like a dull blade, rattling the depot sign and sending tumbleweeds skittering past the loading platform. Thomas Rourke pulled his pocket watch from his vest. 4:37. The westbound stage ran 2 hours behind schedule again, which meant the bride would arrive after sundown in a dress thin as paper. He'd seen her daguerreotype tucked inside Henry Carver's billfold 3 weeks back. A slip of a woman with dark eyes and high cheekbones standing beside a painted backdrop of mountains she'd never seen. Mail-order bride from back east, Henry had said, showing off the photograph like a winning poker hand. She'll civilize this place proper. The afternoon light slanted gold across the valley floor, catching dust motes that danced above the depot bench. Thomas adjusted his wool coat thick as a saddle blanket and twice as warm and settled in to wait. A man kept his word, especially when that word involved meeting another man's bride and escorting her safe to town. The stage appeared first as a dust cloud on the horizon, then as a black dot growing larger against the amber sky. Thomas stood and brushed alkali dust from his hat. The Concord coach lurched to a stop with a squeal of brake leather, and driver Ezra Moon climbed down from his perch, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "Got your lady passenger," Ezra said, nodding toward the coach door. "Quiet as church mice the whole ride." The door swung open, and she stepped down smaller than her photograph suggested, wearing a blue wool dress that had seen better days and clutching a carpet bag like a lifeline. Her breath misted in the cooling air, and Thomas could see her shoulders trembling beneath the thin fabric. "Miss Elena Vasquez?" Thomas touched his hat brim. "I'm Thomas Rourke. Henry Carver sent me to meet you." She nodded, dark eyes taking his measure. "Senor Carver, he is well?" "Right as rain. Just couldn't get away from the store today." Thomas glanced at the sky, where purple clouds gathered above the mountain peaks. "Storm coming in. We best get you into town before it hits." A gust of wind caught her skirts and set her shivering harder. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees since the stage arrived, and night would bring frost certain as Sunday. Thomas looked at her thin dress, then at his own thick coat. "Here." He shrugged out of the wool coat and held it toward her. "You'll catch your death in that dress." Elena stepped back, shaking her head. "No, senor, I cannot." "Sure you can. Henry would tan my hide if I let his bride freeze on the ride to town." Thomas draped the coat over her shoulders before she could protest further. The heavy wool engulfed her small frame, sleeves hanging past her fingertips. "There. Better?" She pulled the coat close, and for the first time since stepping off the stage, her shoulders stopped shaking. "Gracias. You are very kind." Thomas unhitched his bay gelding from the depot rail and helped Elena into the saddle, then swung up behind her. The coat made her seem even smaller, like a child wearing her father's clothes. He clicked his tongue, and the horse stepped into an easy walk toward town. "Henry's got a nice place," Thomas said as they rode. "Store downstairs, living quarters up top. You'll be comfortable there." Elena nodded, but didn't speak. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow from the high country. Thomas felt the cold through his shirt and vest, but the coat would keep her warm until they reached Carver's store. Bitter Creek's main street stretched before them in the gathering dusk false front buildings, casting long shadows across the rutted dirt road. Yellow lamplights spilled from windows, and smoke rose straight up from chimneys before the wind caught it and scattered it like prayers. They stopped in front of Carver's general store, where Henry waited on the covered porch, shifting his weight from foot to foot like a nervous colt. He was a good man, Thomas knew, honest in his dealings and fair with credit, but tonight he looked pale as fresh whitewash. Elena. Henry stepped forward as Thomas helped her down from the horse. You made it safe. She stood before her intended husband, still wrapped in Thomas's coat, and offered a small smile. Si, Senor Carver. The journey was long. But Senor Rourke, he took good care of me. Thomas started to ask for his coat back, then caught himself. The woman would need it tonight, and he could fetch it tomorrow after she'd had time to settle in and find warmer clothes. He touched his hat brim instead. Ma'am? Henry. He turned the bay toward home, where his own cold hearth waited. The first snowflakes began falling as he reached his cabin. Fat flakes that melted on his shoulders and turned the world soft and white. Thomas woke to silence, the peculiar hush that followed a heavy snowfall. He pulled on boots and stepped outside to find the world transformed. Snow lay 3 feet deep across the valley, covering fences and filling creek beds. The sky hung grey and close, promising more weather. He saddled the bay and rode toward town, the horse's hooves crunching through the crust. Bitter Creek looked like a different place under its white blanket. Smoke rose from every chimney, and the few folks out early moved quickly between buildings, hunched against the cold. At Carver's store, Thomas tied his horse to the rail and stomped snow from his boots before pushing through the door. A bell jangled overhead, and warm air scented with coffee and coal smoke washed over him. Henry stood behind the counter, measuring out dried beans for old Mrs. Patterson. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and his usually neat hair stuck up in all directions. Morning, Henry. Thomas nodded to Mrs. Patterson, who clutched her purchases and hurried past him toward the door. Came by to fetch my coat, if Elena's done with it. Henry's hand stilled on the bean scoop. About that, Thomas, I was hoping you might let her keep it a while longer. Her trunk got left behind in Denver, and she's got nothing but that one dress. Through the doorway that led to the upstairs living quarters, Thomas glimpsed Elena sitting at a small table, his coat draped over her shoulders like a shawl. She was writing in a small leather journal, her pen moving quickly across the page. Of course. Thomas kept his voice low. Storm caught us all by surprise. She settling in all right? I suppose. Henry rubbed his forehead with the back of his hand. She's different than I expected. Quieter. And she keeps writing in that book of hers letters, I think, in Spanish. The door chime sounded, and Reverend Morrison stamped in, shaking snow from his black coat. Morning, boys. Thought I'd check on the new arrival. Make sure she's prepared for Sunday service. She's upstairs, Henry said. Elena? Reverend's here to see you. Elena appeared in the doorway, Thomas's coat still wrapped around her small frame. She nodded politely to the Reverend, but stayed where she was. Welcome to Bitter Creek, my dear, Morrison said in his pulpit voice. I trust you'll join us for worship this Sunday. We have a small but devoted congregation. Si, Reverend. Gracias. Elena's fingers tightened on the coat's lapels. Wonderful. And I do hope you'll consider joining Our Lady's Auxiliary. Mrs. Morrison leads a Bible study every Tuesday afternoon. Elena nodded again, but Thomas caught something in her dark eyes. Not fear exactly, but wariness, like a deer that had caught human scent on the wind. After Morrison left, Elena retreated upstairs without another word. Henry watched her go, then turned to Thomas with a troubled expression. She hardly ate any breakfast, and when I mentioned the wedding ceremony, she went pale as a sheet. Henry lowered his voice. Think I made a mistake, Thomas? Maybe we're not suited. Give her time, Thomas said. It's a big change coming out here. Everything's different, the weather, the people, the land itself. But as he rode home through the deepening snow, Thomas wondered if time would be enough. Elena Vasquez seemed like a woman carrying secrets, and secrets had a way of surfacing when you least expected them. That evening, as he sat by his fire whittling a new chess piece, Thomas heard horses approaching through the snow. He set down his knife and moved to the window. In the moonlight, he could see riders, maybe a dozen of them, making their way up the valley. They moved in single file, leading pack animals loaded with bundles and canvas. The riders passed his cabin without stopping, heading toward the flat ground near Willow Creek, where the grass grew thick in summer. Thomas watched until they disappeared into the trees, then returned to his chair by the fire. But sleep came hard that night, and he found himself listening for sounds that never came: voices, horse nickering, the ring of axe on wood. By morning, he'd almost convinced himself he'd dreamed the whole thing. Almost. Thomas rode out early to check his fence lines, following the creek toward the summer pasture, where he ran his small herd of cattle. The snow had stopped during the night, leaving the world crisp and bright. Under a pale Sunday, he smelled smoke before he saw it, not the sharp scent of pine burning, but something different. Mesquite, maybe, and cooking meat. He urged the bay forward, following his nose, and came to the crest of a low hill that overlooked Willow Creek bottom. Below him stretched a village. 24 hide tipis stood in a rough circle on the flat ground near the creek. Smoke rose from cook fires, and he could see people moving between the lodges, women in blankets and long skirts, children playing in the snow, men tending to horses. The pack animals he'd seen the night before grazed nearby, their loads now unpacked and distributed. Thomas sat his horse and stared. In 12 years of living in this valley, he'd never seen an Indian camp this close to town. The local Arapaho bands usually wintered further south, in the sheltered valleys near the Colorado line. A rider detached himself from the camp and rode up the hill toward Thomas, a man about his own age, with braided hair and a blanket coat. He stopped 10 feet away and raised his right hand in greeting. "You are Thomas Rourke," the man said in careful English, "the one who gave his coat to my daughter." Understanding hit Thomas like a physical blow. Elena. The letters she'd been writing. The wariness in her eyes when Reverend Morrison talked about church and ladies' auxiliaries. "Your daughter," Thomas repeated. The man nodded. "I am Joseph Blue Hawk. Elena is my youngest child. She married the white man to help our people, but she did not tell him of her blood." Thomas looked down at the camp again, seeing it with new eyes. This wasn't a war party or a raiding band. These were families, grandparents and children, young mothers with babies on their backs. Refugees, maybe, looking for shelter from the hard winter. "She's been writing to you," Thomas said. "Every week since she came to this place. She told us of your kindness, how you gave your coat to a stranger without asking for anything in return." Blue Hawk's dark eyes studied Thomas's face. "She said you were a good man, one who might understand." "Understand what?" "That we are people, not devils. That we have children who grow cold and hungry, same as white children." Blue Hawk gestured toward the camp. "The soldiers drove us from our winter place. They said we could not stay on land that was promised to us in treaty. So we came here to the daughter who might speak for us." Thomas felt the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. He thought of Elena sitting at Henry's table, writing her careful letters. Of Henry mentioning her letters in Spanish, except they weren't in Spanish at all, but in Arapaho, written in the Spanish script she'd learned at the mission school. "What does she want me to do?" Thomas asked. "Nothing yet. But soon the white men in your town will see our smoke and come with guns. When that happens, she hopes you will remember the coat you gave to a cold woman, and speak for the people who raised her. Blue Hawk turned his horse and rode back down the hill, leaving Thomas alone on the ridge with the morning sun climbing higher and the smoke from 24 cook fires writing stories in the winter air. Thomas rode hard toward town, his mind churning like a butter churn. By the time he reached Main Street, a crowd had gathered in front of the depot. Men stood in tight knots, voices rising and falling like wind through wheat. He caught fragments as he dismounted. Saw the smoke myself. Could be 50 of them. Send word to Fort Collins. Sheriff Ben Hawley stood on the depot platform, trying to restore order. A big man with greying hair and steady hands, Hawley had kept the peace in Bitter Creek for 8 years without firing his gun in anger. "Now hold on," Hawley was saying as Thomas pushed through the crowd. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Could be trappers or surveyors or any number of things." "It's Indians, Ben," called out Pete Morrison, the preacher's brother who ran the saloon. "Jimmy Carver saw them through his spyglass typus and war paint and the whole lot." Thomas caught Hawley's eye and jerked his head toward the sheriff's office. Hawley nodded and raised his voice again. "All right, folks, I'm going to ride out and take a look myself. Until I get back, I don't want to hear any talk of posies or vigilante justice. We'll handle this legal and proper." The crowd began to disperse, but Thomas could see the fear in their faces, fear bred on stories told around winter, Fire's stories of raids and massacres, of settlers found scalped and mutilated. Most of it was moonshine and newspaper lies, but fear didn't care much for truth. In his office, Hawley poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Thomas. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Close enough." Thomas wrapped his hands around the warm cup. "Ben, there's something you need to know about Elena Vasquez." He told Hawley everything about Elena's letters, her father's visit, the camp by Willow Creek. The sheriff listened without interruption, his weathered face revealing nothing. When Thomas finished, Hawley was quiet for a long moment. Then he walked to his window and looked out at the street, where knots of men still gathered and talked in low voices. "How many in the camp?" Hawley asked. 24 families, maybe more. Women and children mostly. "They're not looking for trouble, Ben." "Doesn't matter what they're looking for. It's what they're going to find that worries me." Hawley turned from the window. "Pete Morrison's already talking about riding to Fort Collins for troops, and there's others who'd rather handle it themselves, if you catch my meaning." Thomas caught it. Men like Jake Sullivan, who'd lost a brother in Colorado Territory 10 years back, and Dutch Kessler, whose wife still woke screaming from dreams of painted faces at the window. Good men, mostly, but carrying grudges like infected wounds. "Elena's trying to help them," Thomas said. "Her father said they were driven from their winter camp by soldiers. They've got nowhere else to go." "That may be. But Henry Carver doesn't know his wife is half Arapaho, and when he finds out, there's going to be hell to pay." Hawley drained his coffee cup and reached for his coat. "I better get out there and talk to them before this whole thing blows up in our faces." Thomas stood as well. "I'm coming with you." "Figured you might." Hawley checked his pistol and slipped it back into its holster. "Question is, whose side are you on when the shooting starts?" "The side that keeps innocent folks from dying." Hawley studied his face for a moment, then nodded. "That'll have to do." They were saddling their horses when Henry Carver came running down the street, his face flushed and his eyes wild. He stumbled to a stop beside Thomas's bay, gasping for breath. "She's gone," Henry panted. "Elena, I went upstairs to check on her, and she's not there. Her bag's gone too, and that coat of yours." Thomas and Hawley exchanged glances. Elena had made her choice slipped away to warn her father and his people that the white men were coming with guns and fear. "How long?" Hawley asked. "Can't be more than an hour. I was in the store the whole time, should have heard her leave." Henry grabbed Thomas's stirrup. "You got to help me find her. She doesn't know the country. And there's wolves out there. And, Henry," Thomas said quietly, "there's something you need to know about your wife." But before he could explain, a shot echoed across the valley, sharp and clear in the cold air. Then another, and another. The three men looked toward Willow Creek, where black smoke was beginning to rise above the trees. They rode hard through the snow, Hawley in the lead and Henry bringing up the rear, still demanding answers that would have to wait. The shots had stopped, but the smoke was thicker now, not the thin grey of cook fires, but the black, oily smoke of burning canvas and leather. As they crested the hill above the creek, Thomas saw the camp in chaos. The tipis still stood, but people ran between them, carrying bundles and children. Horses reared and plunged at their picket lines, spooked by the smell of gunpowder and the shouts of armed men. A dozen riders sat their horses at the edge of the camp townsmen Thomas recognized, led by Pete Morrison and Jake Sullivan. They held rifles across their saddles, and their faces were hard as winter ground. "Stay back," Morrison called as the three men approached. "We got this handled." Hawley rode past him without slowing, his badge catching the pale sunlight. "Stand down, Pete. All of you." "Like hell," Sullivan spat. "These savages killed my brother. Time they paid for it. Your brother died in Colorado Territory 10 years ago, and it wasn't any of these people who killed him." Hawley's voice carried the authority of 8 years wearing a star. Now I said, "Stand down." Thomas scanned the camp, looking for Elena and her father. He found them near the largest tipi, where Joseph Bluehawk stood with his arms crossed and his face impassive. Elena stood beside him, still wearing Thomas's thick coat, her dark eyes moving from face to face among the armed men. "There she is," Henry said, spurring his horse forward. "Elena!" She turned at the sound of her name, and, for a moment, her composed mask slipped. Thomas saw fear there, and something else, the look of a woman who had finally been cornered by the truth. Henry dismounted and strode toward her, his boots crunching in the snow. "What are you doing here? I've been worried sick." Elena lifted her chin. "I came to warn my people that angry men were coming with guns." "Your people?" Henry stopped short, confusion replacing anger on his face. "What are you talking about? These are Indians. See, husband. And so am I." The words fell into the winter air like stones into still water, sending ripples in all directions. Henry stared at his wife as if she'd grown a second head. Pete Morrison cursed under his breath. Jake Sullivan raised his rifle. "Well, I'll be damned," Sullivan said. "We got ourselves a squaw lover." Thomas swung down from his horse and stepped between Sullivan and the camp. "You got yourself a problem, Jake, if you don't lower that weapon. This ain't your fight, Rourke. It became my fight when I gave that woman my coat." Thomas kept his voice steady, but his hand moved to the butt of his Colt. "And it's my fight when men talk about shooting women and children." "They ain't people," Morrison said. His preacher's voice turned ugly. "They're godless savages. The Bible says to show kindness to strangers," interrupted a new voice. Reverend Morrison pushed his horse through the circle of armed men, his black coat stark against the white snow. "It says to welcome the sojourner and protect the widow and the fatherless." "Stay out of this, Isaiah," Pete Morrison warned his brother. You don't understand what's at stake here. I understand that you're about to commit murder in the sight of God and man." The Reverend's pale eyes swept the faces of the armed men. "These people have done nothing but seek shelter from the storm. Would you deny them what you would give to any white family?" Joseph Blue Hawk stepped forward, his weathered hands empty and visible. "We do not want war," he said in his careful English. "We want only to live through the winter. Come spring, we will go." "Go where?" Sullivan demanded. "The reservation? You'll just run off again first chance you get." "The reservation is a place of death," Blue Hawk replied simply. "We will go to our cousins in the north or west to the mountains, but we will go." Sheriff Hawley urged his horse between the two groups. "That's good enough for me. Pete, Jake, the rest of you mount up and ride back to town. We'll work this out legal and proper." "Legal?" Sullivan laughed harshly. "Since when is harboring Indians legal?" "Since they haven't broken any laws," Hawley replied. "This is open range, and they got as much right to camp here as anybody." "Not when one of them's married to a white man under false pretenses," Morrison said. "That's fraud, and you know it." All eyes turned to Henry Carver, who stood in the snow staring at his wife, as if seeing her for the first time. Elena met his gaze without flinching, but Thomas could see her hands trembling inside the sleeves of his coat. "Is it true?" Henry asked quietly. "Are you really—" "My mother was Arapaho," Elena said. "She died when I was 7, and the mission school took me in. They taught me to read and write, to dress like a white woman, to speak English without an accent. They said I could pass for Mexican if I was careful. So you lied to me. In your letters, in your photograph, all of it was lies." Elena's voice was steady, but tears had started to freeze on her cheeks. "I lied to save my people. The old ones, the children, they will die if they have no place to shelter. I thought if I married a good man, if I became part of your town, I could speak for them." Henry was quiet for a long moment. The only sound, the wind through the trees and the nervous stamping of horses. Then he turned away from his wife and walked back toward his horse. "Henry, wait," Thomas called. "Where are you going?" "Back to town. To think." Henry mounted his horse and looked back at Elena one last time. "I don't know who you are anymore." He rode away without another word, leaving his wife standing in the snow among her father's people. The armed men watched him go, uncertainty flickering across their faces. "Well?" Sullivan demanded. "What's it going to be, Sheriff?" Hawley considered for a moment, then made his decision. "The camp stays. But I'll be riding out here regular to check on things, and if there's any trouble, any at all, they're gone. We clear?" Blue Hawk nodded solemnly. "We understand, Sheriff. There will be no trouble from us. See that there isn't." Hawley turned to the armed men. "Pete, Jake, rest of you time to go home. Show's over." The men grumbled and argued, but they holstered their weapons and rode away one by one. Thomas stayed behind, watching Elena as she stood beside her father, still wrapped in his wool coat. "What will you do now?" he asked. Elena looked toward town, where the smoke from Henry's chimney rose straight up in the still air. "I do not know. He is a good man, but he did not marry an Indian woman. He married someone who does not exist." "Maybe she does exist," Thomas said. "Maybe she's just more complicated than he thought." Elena managed a small smile. "And maybe some complications are too much for a simple storekeeper to bear." Thomas untied a bundle from his saddle and handed it to her flour and coffee and dried beans he'd brought from his own stores. "For the children," he said. "Gracias." Elena accepted the bundle, her fingers brushing his for a moment. You are a good man, Thomas Rourke. My father sees it, and so do I. As Thomas rode back toward town, he could see smoke rising from the Indian camp, not the black smoke of burning canvas now, but the grey smoke of cook fires and warmth. Behind him, Elena stood in the snow, still wearing his coat, watching the sun set over the valley that had become both refuge and trap. 3 days later, Thomas found Elena sitting on the bench outside Carver's store, his wool coat draped over her shoulders like a shawl. Her carpet bag sat beside her feet, and she was writing in her leather journal again. "Waiting for the stage?" Thomas asked, settling beside her on the bench. "See, it comes at noon." Elena closed the journal and looked down Main Street, where ordinary folks went about their business as if the world hadn't shifted on its axis. "I am going to Denver. There is a school there for Indian children. They need teachers who speak both languages." "What about Henry?" Elena was quiet for a moment. "He came to see me yesterday. He said he was sorry for the things he said, but he could not be married to someone he did not know. I told him I understood." Thomas pulled his pocket watch, 11:45. The stage would arrive soon, and Elena Vasquez would disappear from Bitter Creek as suddenly as she had arrived. "Keep the coat," Thomas said. "You'll need it in Denver." Elena shook her head. "You have been too kind already. Besides, I have something for you." She reached into her carpet bag and pulled out a folded paper. "A letter from my father. He wanted me to give it to you." Thomas unfolded the paper and found a single sentence written in careful English. "The coat you gave my daughter has kept our whole people warm." "I don't understand." "The night I warned the camp about the angry men, my father called a council. The old ones said your kindness was a sign that not all white men see us as enemies. They decided to stay and try to make peace instead of running again." Elena smiled. One coat, but it changed everything. The stage appeared at the end of Main Street, dust rising from its wheels. Thomas helped Elena with her carpet bag and watched as she climbed into the coach. Through the window, she looked smaller than ever in his thick coat, but her dark eyes were steady and sure. "Will you write?" Thomas asked. "Perhaps. If you would like to hear from an Indian schoolteacher in Denver." "I would." The driver cracked his whip, and the stage lurched into motion. Thomas watched until it disappeared around the bend, then walked back into town where the smell of snow hung in the air and smoke rose from every chimney. That evening, Sheriff Hawley stopped by Thomas's cabin with a bottle of whiskey and news from the Indian camp. "Blue Hawk's been talking to folks in town," Hawley said, "settling by the fire, trading for supplies, offering to cut firewood for the winter. Old Mrs. Patterson hired 2 of the women to help with her washing. Any trouble?" "Some grumbling from the usual suspects, but nothing serious. Reverend Morrison's been preaching about Christian charity, which helps." Hawley poured 2 glasses of whiskey. Funny how one woman's lie turned into everybody's truth. Thomas sipped his whiskey and stared into the fire. Outside, snow had begun falling again. Fat flakes that turned the world soft and white. Somewhere out there, Joseph Blue Hawk's people were settling in for another winter night, warm in their teepees beside Willow Creek. And somewhere on the road to Denver, Elena Vasquez rode through the darkness toward whatever came next, wrapped in a coat that had somehow become large enough to shelter them all. If something in this story touched you, linger with us. We'll handle the rest.